Crash course in the history of the Japanese writing system. Let's go. So, Japan exists, people have been there for tens of thousands of years, and for a long time none of them write anything. This is not like a critique, this is pretty normal. As far as we're aware, writing has been invented by people that know nothing about writing 4 times around the world. It's pretty hard to do. Inventing a writing system when you see other people write and be like, oh, they're doing a writing thing, I should get that for my own, that's a bit easier, and that has been done more than that. But starting from scratch, having nothing, and then coming up with a writing system, that's really, really rare. But, of course, one group of people that did do this is the people in ancient China, and they're pretty close to Japan. So through contact between what we now call China and Japan, possibly through the area that we now call Korea, exchange started happening, and this is how Japanese people encountered Chinese writing. In an ancient form, of course, not exactly what we have now. The first encounters were likely through things like gifts, presents, seals, definitely swords, found ones dating back to at least the 500s, but we're not exactly sure when Japanese people started to write. General estimates are that Japanese people were writing, though, by around 600 AD, if not earlier. And unquestionably, they were writing in the 700s because that is when 3 major books, the Kojiki, the Manyoshu, and the Nihon Shoki all came out. The Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are both kind of mythological histories. Samson famously, back in the 1920s, described the Kojiki as starting with the creation of Japan and then moving in ascending credibility towards, Japanese history. While the Manyoshu is a collection of poems, with some poems existing in the Kojiki as well. Now, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are predominantly written in forms of basically ancient Chinese. Just like Latin was kind of the lingua franca, especially the written lingua franca of much of Europe for some periods, throughout Asia, and including Japan, when Japanese people were writing, most of them were not initially writing Japanese, they were writing in Chinese, or a literary form of ancient Chinese, to be more specific. That said, in the Manyoshu especially, which is poetry, so it needs to be quite phonetic, there was already use of kanji for sound, as in just to represent phonetics. Some of this has phonetics and meanings. For instance, the word kawa, or river, is commonly written with this character for the ka, not always, but commonly, which that character happens to have the meaning of river, so there's some kind of intentionality there. And while the Nihon Shoki especially is based on Chinese writing, the Kojiki has not only this phonetic bits, but it has an introduction, which actually is a discussion of various ways to write in Japan at the time, and the reason they went with the way that they wrote for the Kojiki. So what this shows to us is that while these 3 books are the first texts that we still have copies of, it is very clear that Japanese people were, as this book here notes, these also stand as evidence that Japanese people were writing confidently by the 700s. That is, they had developed multiple styles. These styles were all heavily based in classical Chinese, but these texts represent confident authors working within a style, not people figuring out things for the first time. Although we do have to remember that at this time, the number of people that were literate, the number of people that could write, was a very, very small amount of the population. A few more hundred years then, Japanese people in different areas, in different fields, in different styles, developed different ways of writing in Japanese. Some, again, just used classical Chinese. Others used forms where the sentence kind of had to be decoded into Japanese, which was a very complex process that you should be very thankful we have to do now. And the Chinese writing system was not really built for showing things like the kind of complex inflections that Japanese has and Chinese does not. Around the 1800s, though, solutions happened to come up, and this is the creation of hiragana and katakana. Now, neither of these were anything that anyone intended to create. There's a really classic, funny video about the history of Japan, which you might have seen, and it's mostly accurate. It's really good edutainment, but it does claim that somebody went to China, came back, and created hiragana and katakana. This is probably a reference to Kukai, who is a guy that did a lot of stuff, but also a lot of stuff that he did not do is attributed to him. There was no intention in Japan of making a second or third writing system. Use of kanji for phonetic reasons, which I discussed earlier, and has been used in China before the characters ever came to Japan, continued, and eventually, through people developing cursive styles of writing, the characters became less and less and less visible as characters and ended up as kind of blobs, which became hiragana. There was no coordination here, there was no intent. It's not like in Korea where a person sat down and developed the basis for a writing system, and as a result, there were many redundant characters, there was many inconsistencies between people, but it did appear, again, within the 800s. The same thing happened with katakana, although for a different purpose. First people to do this were Buddhist priests, who were using this as kind of a phonetic guide. You had complex kanji, and some people would write, kanji above them that had the same reading but were less complex to help with reading, and they realized, hey, there's not a lot of space, what if we just take pieces of those and pop them there? And eventually those pieces got formalized, kind of. Again, there were redundant ones, and that developed into katakana. People then started playing with katakana, hiragana, and kanji combinations. Some of these involved katakana and kanji only, hiragana and katakana only, and it's not hard to find texts throughout the next 1,000+ years which use hiragana and katakana together in a way that feels quite random. There wasn't a lot of consistency whatsoever, and a lot of complexity, and a lot of difference between generations, class, styles of writing, like poetry versus, official documents, trends of the time. As Frelsevig notes, about 1,000+ years of development can be summed up by stating that there was high complexity and everything had at least some kind of rooting in classical Chinese. outside of, like, again, poetry or maybe the more vernacular styles that you might see on like a play script or something like that that's meant to be spoken. In the 1800s, though, when we start to see some real change happening, because this is when Japan, especially Japanese scholars, especially Japanese linguists who were sent abroad, start to get the idea that Japan needs to have a singular writing system and that Japan needs to have writing reform. This is built in with dialogues around nationalism at the time, which of course did lead to some very bad things. But on the more harmless side, it brought about this idea that Japan needed kind of a singular writing system that could be accessible to the entire population. And this resulted in a number of social movements which had up and down success. A number of scholars were able to push for reforms in, for instance, how many hiragana were used, and especially newspapers and public-facing novels became a key source of reformed writing systems, but they weren't officially approved by the government. This entire process was known as the Genbun Ichi movement, or the unification of writing and script, and involved not only writing reforms, but also just reforms to the way that Japanese people wrote. It was a period of a lot of new experimentation and change in just how Japanese authors approach things like novels, etc., and has massive influence on the Japanese that we use today in both speech and writing, in terms of structure, norms, presentation, etc. as well. There were a number of setbacks, including even just natural disasters, believe it or not. Basically, the issue is that, especially in the more conservative sectors of the government, which of course increased, not decreased, as we moved to the end of the 1800s, kanji were seen as a kind of symbol of Japaneseness and Japanese history, Japanese identity, which made them very, very hesitant to have any kind of reform. Of course, they also put forward, more quote-unquote practical explanations, but that's sort of the thing that's come up time and time again. We can see a similar thing happening, for instance, in Korea, with this sort of belief that kanji are the mark of the educated and the elite, resulting in the slow uptake of Hangul after its first invention, as the real boost was after World War II. So while some progress was made, it all kind of backslid as Japan became more and more nationalistic and became more and more anti-Western, and real reform to the Japanese writing system didn't happen until the end of World War II. So arguably, from some perspectives, the Japanese writing system we learn in Japanese classes today is less than 100 years old. Not in terms of the fundamental concept of mixing hiragana and katakana, etc., but in terms of the roles we have. Indeed, one of the predominant writing styles which mixed kanji and kana together before the end of World War II mixed kanji with katakana, not hiragana, so it had kind of the role that hiragana has now. That said, one thing that does make kind of all this hard to talk about is while we know what the official writing styles were, newspapers, novels, public-facing documents, etc., what the average individual person does, especially from 1000 AD to the 1800, is very hard because those kind of documents, letters from one person to another, aren't really well preserved. Nevertheless, at the end of World War II, there was finally enough pressure, especially from the American government, to reform the Japanese writing system officially on a governmental level. The American government pushed for the abolishment of kanji, and some Japanese people were in support of that, as well as, of course, the Roman alphabet. And in my own research, for instance, I've even seen people propose Sanskrit. The researchers have noticed proposals just to use French. But, of course, those didn't work, and we ended up with a reform system which reduced the number of kanji, set out standards for the use of hiragana and katakana, and was basically okay. There were clear problems that rose up pretty fast. Many people especially were upset by the fact that their family names or the names of the areas that they live in were not allowed to use certain kanji. And so this led to the creation of the Joyo kanji list and a list of kanji just for people names and place names. These have also seen expansion, with the Joyo kanji list now being larger than it used to be, but it seems to be pretty stable right now. There have been a few times where some kind of major change would have happened. In the 70s and 80s, there was a bit of a worry that technology would not allow Japanese people to produce kanji on word processing documents, computers, etc., but that was quickly resolved, showing that pretty much every case of hand-wringing about, oh, kanji are going to die, has been incorrect. I'd say the introduction of technology, texting, etc. has drastically damaged the average Japanese person's ability to handwrite, just as it has destroyed English speakers' ability to spell things. The ability to read kanji has gone up, with words like kirei coming back into use in kanji, at least in writing, because people see them so much because it's so easy to produce them, where they were not used so much earlier, and with katakana being the preferred representation. My personal estimate, it's very unlikely that we'll see any extreme changes to the Japanese writing system moving forward. It might be some increases in kanji, certainly increases into the kanji that are found in Unicode. I personally imagine stability being the highest outcome for the future. So there you go, crash course. If you'd like to learn more though, Japanese, I already recommended Nihon to Kanji. It's a pretty recent book by a scholar who's done a lot on that. If you like pictures, this book here, Nihongo no Rekishi, is harder to read, I would say, but it has some really great images of it, of Japanese writing kind of throughout history, and you can see the differences in the various things that were used. For a more casual English overview of the history of the Japanese writing system, the book Chinese Characters Across Asia, which just came out this year, is fantastic, and it can give you an overview of the context of Japanese in the entirety of Asia and how the writing system was developed and why. Christopher Seeley's A History of Writing in Japan is a solid Japanese-focused introduction. But if you read this, or if you look at this and like, man, this is not academic enough for me, I want my book to be even bigger, A History of the Japanese Language by Frelsevig is about as intense and detailed as you can possibly get. This is not an easy read, but it is the most thorough text that I'm aware of on the subject. If you're looking more specifically as the change from the 1800s, early 1900s into World War II into what we have now, Kanji Politics by Nanette Gottlieb is a classic on this subject and will get you what you need to know. So there you go, the end. I didn't time it. It's probably longer than a crash course, but I hope you liked it. Terrible ending.